This is the first of a series of 4 sessions in January where we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on religion in the UK. And so now I'm going to pass you over to Andrew Brown to host this first session.
Thank you all for turning up. I think we're dealing here with quite a wide variety of faiths, and quite a variety of organizations, so to say. I'm going to start with David Walker, the Bishop of Manchester, because the Church of England actually has a central decision-making body of sorts, the General Synod, which will meet in February, and which is trying to decide how to react to the financial pressures of the pandemic. And David is in charge of, or runs one of the committees, which is, or the committee, which is coordinating the various subcommittees, which are considering what to do about this. So can you give us an idea of your thinking, David, on this?
Certainly, Andrew, and thank you. And yeah, I mean, I chair a number of things. I effectively chair the Church Commissioners Board of Governors. Legally, the chair is the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he has the power to designate a deputy chair who chairs all the kind of functions of the Church Commissioners, and I do that. And the Church Commissioners is our endowment fund. It's currently, well, latest figure I've got for it is about 8 point something billion pounds sterling invested in a whole range of asset classes over the world. So that's the kind of piggy bank, and I guess I sometimes think I'm the Anglican equivalent of that Catholic gentleman who was found hanging from the Blackfriars Bridge about 30 years ago. I hold some of the purse strings for the system, but that probably isn't for reporting directly. I also chair what's called the coordinating group, which brings together a series of strands of work that are under the standard title of emerging church. And those strands of work, one of them is about particularly COVID recovery, and the Bishop of London chairs that, Sarah Mullally. And that really is kind of the group through which we engage with government on a fairly frequent basis over things like what was happening last night. So Sarah would have been in touch with government at various times during yesterday before the Prime Minister made his announcement last night. And that group helps us to, as far as possible, to have a kind of a bit of a team effort in terms of how we're responding to the COVID crisis, in terms of what it's doing about churches opening, closing, and the like. The next strand is being led by the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell. This was planned before COVID happened, which was simply saying we need a kind of a group to look at medium-term vision and strategy for the Church of England. What the next 10 years look like? There was a report to General Synod in November, and there will probably be a further report coming to General Synod in February. And that helps us get a sense of what is kind of really important to be happening at a national level. It won't determine what dioceses do at local level, but it can determine what happens at national level, and that determines to some extent what resources the Church Commissioners, how those resources are directed to support the things that are going on at more local levels. There's also a strand of work that's around governance that's being led by the Bishop of Leeds at the moment, and that's kind of looking at, do we have the right governance systems in place for the Church of England for the future? The current governance system, the Archbishop's Council, alongside Church Commissioners, Synod, House of Bishops. The last really big look at that was back in the 1990s. So it's probably about time to have another look at that again and say, are all the functions being governed adequately and in the right place?
Particularly on this governance point, you went on the Sunday programme in the spring, and you appeared to me to be saying that one of the problems of the Church of England is that it's much too hard to close churches that nobody any longer needs, and we need to change the governance. Is this a fair statement of your position?
I do believe that, and the joke about the Church of England, it has the engine of a lawnmower and the brakes of a supertanker, and I think that it's easier to stop things happening than to get things to happen. And I think that I was on record there. I'm happy to reiterate. I think at the moment, to close a single church, the levels of appeal that there are that you have to go through, the rights of objection are so extensive that it often means that the same decision has to be made several times before it actually has been formally made. And I think it will be eminently possible to streamline some of that so that serious objections can be heard, but it is actually possible for decisions to be taken in a more timely fashion than is at present possible.
What sort of churches, what classes of churches is it that you feel that the Church of England can no longer afford? Is it the rural churches, for example, where we have, something like, I seem to remember the bottom 10% of the parishes bring in less than £5,000 a year? What can be done with a church whose congregation can only pay £5,000 a year towards its upkeep, the salary of the vicar, and so on and so forth?
I don't think this is about a retreat from the countryside. I mean, when I was a vicar, I had one village that had a population of 102, and we got typically 8 or 9 to our 2 Sunday services there, 8 or 9 in the morning, 8 or 9 in the evening. And it was perfectly financially viable because we resourced it from the other churches in the team that I and my colleagues served. And the building was in good condition. It had some money in the bank in case that the roof fell through, and it was well insured. And so sheer numbers alone don't necessarily mean that the church should close. Obviously, my current position, I'm more interested in much of my diocese is urban, and the kind of places I can think of, if I can look at part of East Manchester, where a number of churches were closed in probably in the early 2000s, that enabled a brand new church to be built. That has much better facilities. It can run everything from a little cafe to a whole host of community groups and activities. The building is going to be in good condition for some time to come, and it's got a growing congregation because people like to be part of a church where they can have that level of activity going on. And that replaced a number of buildings that were a huge drain on resource, and in an area where pretty well everything else had gone. That part of East Manchester has seen massive demolition. The slum houses went in the 60s and 70s. The high-rise blocks that were often put up to replace them then went because they didn't turn out to be a long-term good place to live. And so the population levels in those places are now a fraction of what they were even a generation ago. And so a new way of doing church in those places, so we can still bring services, have worship in those communities, but not in the buildings we had it in before, and with fewer buildings. I think that's been an eminently sensible sort of change, and that's the sort of thing where population have moved. Parts of urban Britain had in 2000 20% of the density of population they had in 1900, even before you start taking into account the much greater faith diversity there are in many of those areas now. So I guess if I had a list of what sort of church is the one that's most likely to require closure, I'd be thinking typically of a mid-Victorian building that was built to last a century. It's lasted well over a century and a half, but the physical structure is tired, it's very large, and there isn't the community around it that there was when it was built 150, 170 years ago.
Okay, at a rough guess, how many of those would you say there are across England at the moment?
I really couldn't hazard a guess.
I know that the Victorian era was one of the 2 great church building booms of British history.
It was. And a certain amount of building, though, was done. And I think the Middle Ages seemed to take more care of building quality. I think a lot of stuff was put up in the Victorian era to be big and showy, but kind of component life cycle wasn't necessarily the first thing on people's lists. It was often a particular perhaps area, one of the church that was bigger and flashier than the one down the road. So right. I think there are I think those are the sorts of churches, I say, that the population numbers, that they were built to serve populations that just don't exist.
Well, sticking still to the, actually there's a general question for everybody. How surprised were you to discover that the lockdown regulations will allow public worship, and how much difference do you think this is going to make?
Do you want me to answer that in the first instance, and then?
Oh, go on.
I think I'm beyond the age when I'm easily surprised by almost anything that politicians come up with or don't come up with. So I wasn't particularly surprised, because we have shown that public worship can be very COVID secure. I think the latest figures that the government have got, which I'm not sure whether they're public figures or internal, show the number of COVID cases since COVID began, traceable to infection being passed on at a service of public worship. It's double figures. It's not even 100. It's well below 100. So all the evidence is that that places of worship have been made pretty COVID secure. It's probably one of the most COVID secure things you can do outside of your front door.
Osama,
or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple.
right. Osama, how did this appear from a Muslim perspective?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Andrew and David. So I imagine, like other places of worship, most mosques, well, every mosque I know, depends hugely on the weekly Friday collection. In fact, there have always been disputes over how you structure the Friday prayers to maximize your Friday collection, because traditionally you have a short sermon. You're supposed to have a short sermon followed by prayers, and attention, people have to give full concentration to the sermon. Nobody's allowed to talk or say a word during the sermon, and so nothing can distract the congregation during the sermon or the reminder or the address, the Friday address, whatever you want to call it. It can be all three. And so that includes, you cannot do a collection during the service, because that distracts people. Now, what a lot of mosques do for that reason is, and because also the sermon is short, so they have a long talk beforehand, and then during the talk and after the talk, they go between the rows, much as they do amongst church pews, to actually maximize the collection, because they can't do that during the official sermon and the prayers. Now, at my own mosque, where I served for 25, 30 years, we always wanted to stick to what was the original tradition, and we didn't actually agree with long talks beforehand. It was a shortish sermon and prayers. So the only option we had was Friday collection on the way out, as people left, depending on the quality of the service they'd received. They would have that. Now, obviously, those Friday collections have been hit hugely. Most mosques are running 2 Friday prayer services on Fridays because of the social distancing. Some in the past, or even now, might even run 3 or 4. But a striking example of the financial impact on mosques is that possibly the most iconic mosque in Britain, the Regent's Park Mosque in central London, in a royal park on royal land, which, if you go to the Charity Commission website, you will see all its trustees. Its board of trustees includes representatives of about 14 Muslim majority embassies around the world. So it has powerful state support, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, Malaysia, many other countries actually. And traditionally, actually, for the last 30, 40 years, the Saudis have funded the mosque, while the Egyptians have provided the imams. Now, that is changing somewhat. And you will see that Regent's Park Mosque, if you go to this Muslim crowdfunding platform called Launch Good, Regent's Park Mosque are running a fundraising campaign. Or they were running it throughout December, actually. It'll be interesting to see how much they raised, to say we are short of funds because of the mosque being closed all year. And it's just a striking example. Now, other mosques are obviously hit by the same thing. One of the other problems we have is that perhaps other religious traditions have switched to online prayers very quickly, online prayer services, Zoom prayer services. The way Muslim prayer services are held, with very specific actions of standing, bowing, prostration, etc., people standing in rows, that is not easily transferable online. So I've not heard of any online prayer services at all, in fact. But of course, there are online activities like lectures and talks, maybe a bit of chanting and singing for those mosques that actually allow that kind of thing. But it's very much in flux, I would say. People are still learning, adjusting to COVID. I think the new year now with the vaccine in sight will kind of make their response mature. And just one final point is that what we're seeing is more community activities. I think all of this situation has focused the minds on as to what what is the point of the place of worship then? And what I'm seeing more is the community actions such as food banks and baby banks. Now, every church that I know in my area seems to be running a food bank or a community fridge or something like that. And I did a quick survey, maybe about a quarter to a fifth, 20 to 25% of the mosques in this area are doing something similar. And others are slowly thinking about it because it's not historically something they've been used to doing. But, you know, it is happening, which is a good thing. Another thing is a baby bank. You know, my wife and I actually volunteer at a local church.
Bank, sorry.
Yeah. A baby bank is where people donate newborn clothes for babies, nappies, white, you know, all of this.
It's not like
a lot of newborn mothers in the inner cities struggle. You know how expensive it is to have a baby. So that's something which I am planning to copy from our local church and inspired by our local church, is to introduce the food bank and baby bank to our local mosque and Islamic charities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Hamid, so there was the very celebrated incident where we had Seat going down to help out the lorry drivers stranded in Kent. But what has been the financial impact of all this on your communities?
No, sure. So yeah, no, that was our colleagues from Khalsa Said. In fact, most Gurdwaras and most Sikh organizations, a lot of the outreach work is through the distribution of food, through the langar concept. By way of background, very quickly, so Gurdwaras are quite decentralized. They don't have they run locally by local volunteers, which makes it very easy in a way to react to events like the pandemic, but also means we can't pool and share resources as other organizations or other places worships and faiths can, which makes it a little bit difficult. Now, of course, we've faced a double whammy of a massive reduction in income from our congregation, but equally a huge increase in demand on our services, particularly food. So yeah, as you just rightly mentioned, Andrew, down in Dover, the standard drivers are fed. I mean, throughout the pandemic, our Gurdwara in West London, we were feeding the best part of, still are, sort of 3,500 to 4,000 meals a day, albeit now takeaway, which is a very expensive operation to run. As an organization, we've struggled. We've had to adapt, cut costs, as many Gurdwaras have. We're slightly fortunate. We're based in West London, which has a big Sikh population, so we can depend on them. But I know many of the smaller Gurdwaras up and down the country have struggled because they typically rely on things like weddings, family events, birthdays, anniversaries, which are held in a Gurdwara and celebrated in a Gurdwara, which generate a substantial portion of the income.
Yeah, but have there been any Gurdwaras that have actually closed as a result of the pandemic?
Not due to financial pressures just yet. I know my colleague Bravinder from the Sikh Council's on here. He'd completed a survey, and I'm sure he'll share those findings. I don't believe any have actually closed just yet. I do know many are struggling and are assessing the long-term viability, especially in the smaller towns where there isn't a big Sikh population to support them. And you know, we are beginning to receive, us being a bigger Gurdwara in the UK, one of the biggest, we do occasionally receive requests for help from smaller Gurdwaras, and we are beginning to see an increase in that.
So circuitously to David Palmer, who is a former diocesan treasurer in Birmingham, for the Catholic clergy have a particular problem in that they really live off their congregations very directly. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church is very much structured on large dioceses. So Birmingham has 220 parishes, which has the advantage of some strength in numbers, but COVID has hit the collections. People aren't attending in person because of numbers. They're watching on live stream, but fixed costs continue, and we've got the added costs of cleaning, PPE, and live streaming. We're working on giving people the opportunity to exercise the charism of giving by donating online, but I do believe we'll survive with God's help. He fed 5,000 with a couple of loaves and fishes. One of the problems, as you've mentioned, we face is that priests are not eligible to receive anything under the self-employed income support scheme. And they are dependent upon donations for masses, baptisms, weddings, and in particular Easter and Christmas offerings. And the Easter offering didn't happen at all, and Christmas has been very much cut. So that is a problem. They are surviving. I know that later you're looking at online church and the difficulty of charity work, which is much needed. But one area where we're quite concerned about it is the whole issue of social interaction. It's not just the elderly, it's those struggling with family commitments or single people who may have been furloughed. There's only a certain amount one can do with Zoom youth meetings, carol singing and quizzing. We're human beings, we're social beings. And although money is tight, it's not the driving force, and we need to look at ways of reaching out to people. And then one area which I am concerned about is we've relied for many years very heavily on volunteers. And dare I say it, many of them are at risk because of age. And many of our parish workers can't come to work because the presbyteries are the place they work, and that's the priest's home. And many of our priests are at risk because of age. So I can see a huge backlog of what I'll loosely call administrative work, particularly financial record keeping, that is going to hit us during 2021. So budgeting in particular has been an interesting game this year. It's a strange situation being hit from a number of different angles. I don't think finance is the real driver. It's the maintaining community, and finance is one of the constraints on that.
Various people are picking up on David Walker's light-hearted, well, perhaps not at all light-hearted introduction, explaining that he sits and chairs the church commissioners in essence, and they have £8 billion in assets. Andrew Grayston was particularly exercised by this and had a question which he better ask.
I'll just read the two questions about the Church of England's financial resources often crop up in an apologetic context. The first is, how can an organisation that follows Christ's example of poverty have more than £8 billion in its piggy bank, as you called it? And the second is, how can an organisation that has £8 billion in reserves suggest that it's running out of cash? I wonder if Bishop David could address those. I suppose the umbrella question is it possible that God actually wants a smaller, poorer church, and that he's trying to tell you something?
Thank you, Andrew, and good to see you. I'm often asked, why doesn't the Church of England sell all and give to the poor? And the stock answer to that is that we're doing it. We're just doing it in a measured and sustainable way. So, for example, my diocese, 48% of parishes in the Diocese of Manchester come in the 10% poorest parishes of the Church of England. And each year we get over £2 million from the church commissioners, which helps us sustain mission and ministry in those largely inner city and outer urban estate locations where the local congregation could never raise the amount of money that's necessary in order to sustain the level of church activity among the poor, with the poor, for the poor that is going on in those places. And it is all the kind of food banks and stuff that we've been hearing about earlier, the winter night shelters, the community groups, everything from Alcoholics Anonymous to mother and toddler groups to groups for the luncheon clubs for the elderly. All of that work goes on because the church commissioners can subsidise it on an annual basis, and we can do that because we work out every 3 years roughly how much money can be disbursed to parishes and dioceses over the next 3 years, and then kind of stick to that. And so over the current period of 3 years, 2021 is the middle of those 3 years, we can spend, I think, £300 million a year goes from the church commissioners to support the life of the church in dioceses, in parishes and elsewhere. And we can do that because we have the fund there to to back us up. It enables us to prime new mission opportunities through things like strategic development funding, as well as lowest income communities money. So I wouldn't arrogate to myself to say what God's wish for the church is on this particular matter, but I think there is a case for saying that that historic money, which has been accumulated over a period of time, is being well spent. Much of it came from Queen Anne's bounty. Queen Anne, who was concerned about the poverty of the clergy who didn't have lands to live off, and that money still goes to the purposes that Queen Anne set it up to do just over 300 years ago.
But diagnostically, what you're saying is that the Church of England is sustained by dead Christians and not by live ones.
Well, the church
when you're looking at it as the Bishop of Manchester, I looked at your diocesan figures. The diocese as a whole made a loss of about £1 million last year, did it not?
Indeed,
which is an appalling budget. Are there any general figures for how much the church has lost in this pandemic? Several people wanted to know. I was quoted by one member of the Archbishop's Council, a grand figure of 150 million. The Church Times got a figure of 40 million out of Church House last week. Do you have any figure for what the consequences of the lockdown have been in terms of parish giving?
No, I don't think any national figure that I've not seen any figure that's been computed yet. And of course, it's still ongoing. Most dioceses won't. They do their accounts on an annual basis. The year end is 31st of December, but they allow parishes to make late payments for up to typically a few weeks into January, where for their parish share. So it's usually not until late February that we've got a reasonably accurate picture of what the outturn of the previous year was. What we know is that dioceses have been hit hard, and it's not just the giving income from congregations. I think in dioceses like mine, it's often loss of hall income, all the various groups and activities, the scouts, the brownies, all the things that take place in the church hall that are no longer happening, and therefore the rents for those are not coming in. But as colleagues said a few minutes ago, a lot of the fixed costs are still having to be paid. So it's the loss of that income, particularly for the poorer dioceses. That means that particularly poor dioceses in the north have been probably the hardest hit in terms of the actual COVID reduction in giving. The total income of Church of England parishes in a typical year is about 1.1 billion. So 40 million is what, about 4% of 1.1 billion. But obviously giving figures are hit harder than some other figures, and it's what it is. It's a big hit, but we don't know the figures nationally yet.
Okay, can I at this point bring in Christopher James? I wondered, because the last time we talked to you, which was at a tablet party we had, you were talking in very sort of strategic terms about the religious landscape of England over the next 20 years or so, and how the churches are going to have to cope with this. And I wondered if you had thoughts about the long-term outcome of this COVID. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, a Catholic journalist was saying rather gleefully, "Well, that's it. This is just going to finish off the established churches." Presumably that isn't your view, but how do you think it will reshape the religious landscape?
Are you using the term religious there to mean religious orders or religion in general?
Religion in general, not the orders.
Well, the reason I'm so interested to participate in these presentations by the Religious Media Centre is I thought that the 4 topics that have been outlined are the 4 key areas we have to examine. And I don't yet have an answer to how those 4 areas will develop. But I do know that the first task is to find the right questions to ask about those 4 areas. I think gathering the facts, as you've been doing so far in this session, about how different religious communities are finding the financial impact is a very good starting point. David Palmer rightly said that it's not the driver, but finance is quite a good way of telling you what's happening. You know, if you see what's happening to the money, you can often see what's happening more broadly. And the point about the money is you can actually measure it. So, you know, the decline in giving illustrates the decline in participation. And then you have the challenge of, well, how do we make up for, how do we find new ways of participation? So I would think the first sort of question to look at is how many ways of participation will there be? So most churches, I think, are saying they found the online experience has been a positive one, but of course it cannot substitute for the in-person participation. So the question will be, can we continue to offer both in some way? In other words, a new ways of offering participation. And certainly as regards events other than worship, talks, discussions, and so on, the anecdotal evidence is that far more people turn up to an online talk than turn up to a talk in a drafty church hall. So I think that that's the first area, but I do think the other areas that the RMC is going to examine, each of them merits us finding the right question to ask. But what I think will start to emerge is, in each of the areas, will be what I call both and in the area of finance, you know, typically the traditional collection's fine, but we'll also have to look at other ways of raising funding. So I'd say I think what's emerging is a both and approach to the future of religious communities. And the trick will be to find the right questions to ask about the right areas for your own faith community.
Sorry, Osama, do you think that these more impersonal styles of giving may spread to the Muslim communities? I'm interested in the idea of replacing just dropping something into the collection plate, as it were, with direct debits or any of the other methods used in the Christian churches at the moment. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more tech-savvy mosques and charities have been doing that for a long time, actually. I mean, my own mosque, we had standing orders and direct debit set up in a website even way before other mosques. And I think it will be a question of survival. For survival, they will have to do that. And, you know, Zoom activities, as a colleague just said, far more people attend online. It's much easier, obviously. And especially, you know, traditionally women wouldn't go to the mosque in the same numbers as men. So a lot of mosques in Britain actually don't cater for women as well as they could. Often the women's prayer space is much smaller than the men's space, but with the online activities, you know, the women can equally join in. And there's obviously a brilliant opportunity to do fundraising because you have more people joining in. But the key is in the type of event you have, you know, if you still have boring sermons, you know, let's be honest, or irrelevant discussions about religion, which have nothing to do with the community, then you're not going to get very far. But if you have kind of exciting, relevant type work, which is why I mentioned the food bank and baby bank, what I'm seeing is people will be energized to get involved with that kind of activity, and that will itself lead to more source of income, I believe, for mosques and other places of worship.
Harriet was asking a particular question of Bishop David. In particular, can you be a bit clearer? I mean, basically, she's asking for a newsline. Do you expect churches to close and indeed the number of clergy to be reduced as a consequence of this?
Thank you. I'll have a go. Before I do, can I just correct one thing that's come up in the chat box? I think the reference to the church commissioners having effectively given two tranches of money to support the Church of England, 75 million and then a further 35. The 75 million was actually what's called the liquidity move. That was allowing dioceses to borrow short-term money if they needed it to pay stipends when the COVID first started, and it was also paying forward for the whole of 2020 the money for like lowest income communities that dioceses would normally receive on a monthly basis. So that wasn't new money. That was either money being handed over a little bit sooner than would have originally been intended, and money being available so that dioceses wouldn't suddenly run out of cash. Because when you have an immediate crisis like COVID, the first thing you have to do is make sure you actually got enough cash to pay the daily bill. So that wasn't actually a grant of money. The 35 million sustainability fund, that is money that dioceses have been bidding for and using to offset some of the harshest impact of the increased deficits that they've had through COVID. And my diocese, like the majority of dioceses, has had some money through that. So I think that's worth correcting, because I think that's where the Church Times story is particularly I think confusing. It makes it look as though there were both sums of money being handed over. Do I expect churches to close and number of clergy to be reduced, to put it starkly? Churches have always been closing. I think what COVID does is it accelerates some things that were already pressures in the system. So it probably makes it more urgent. There'll be some churches that may well, particularly the sort of places I talked about earlier, may well have lost much of what remained of the congregation during the COVID year, that people won't necessarily come back and they won't have the church officers to run those places. And I think we do have to look, every diocese has to look hard at whether it's got the right buildings in the right places. So church buildings have always been closing. That will continue. I suspect the pace will increase as a result of COVID. Clergy numbers is an interesting one. I think what we're seeing, there have been quite an uptick in vocations in recent years, and we've certainly experienced that in Manchester with more younger people, men and women, and from wonderfully diverse backgrounds coming forward to train for full-time Church of England ministry. I think these are exactly the sorts of people I want to be running parishes in 5 and 10 years' time. We do, of course, at the other end of the scale, have a lot of clergy who are close to retirement. If you look at the kind of demographics, we've got that younger age group starting to come in now, and we've got quite a lot of people around my age. I'm in my early 60s who are probably, who are not going to be in post in 10 years' time. Whether there'll be some of those clergy might choose to go sooner rather than later. Whether dioceses will support clergy in doing that, those will be decisions that dioceses will make at a local level. So it's not just about the sheer number of clergy in post. It's about what sort of clergy they are, and where.
Okay. What about, however, the number of dioceses? Do you expect those to remain the same?
Despite the Daily Mail's figure of 10 dioceses, I've certainly no knowledge of any work going on at the moment that's actually looking at reducing the number of dioceses to any particular figure. I mean, you've got different.
You said to any particular figure.
Well, obviously, even looking at reducing it. I think there's always a question. I mean, we had the merger of 3 Yorkshire dioceses about a decade or so ago, wasn't it? To create the Diocese of Leeds as it now is. I think there are, if you ask around the Church of England, I think there are 2 schools of thought. One says that actually you have more but smaller dioceses, but make them administratively much lighter. So you have bishops, perhaps more like they have in Africa, with a much smaller diocese, much more hands-on, and then you maybe have a lot of the administrative structure moved up to a kind of regional level, or you could say you have fewer dioceses. Historically, we had 26. Is that a number that means anything other than just history? And you focus on perhaps amalgamating potentially, as was done in the West Yorkshire case. So I think there's different ways to look at it. If reducing dioceses is the answer, I suppose that you have to ask, well, what actually is the question? Is it about efficiency? Is it about pastoral oversight? Is it about what level administration should take place at?
Well, no, I was thinking purely looking at it, because this is meant to be a financially focused call. Earlier than last year, I suppose now, I was looking through the accounts of the various dioceses which are published. I think there was one which was running in surplus. I mean, you have these 42 administrative entities, almost all of which are making a loss of anything up to £1 million a year. It seems a very odd way to run things. Shouldn't you have fewer which are actually capable of more or less paying for themselves?
Well, if they were still paying for the same number of most of the costs, diocesan costs are on clergy. So if you had fewer dioceses but the same number of clergy, you might have saved a few bishop stipends if you didn't have to pay those, if you didn't have to replace those bishops with other people. But you wouldn't actually have done much to address those kind of £1 million deficits. If you have, £1 million deficit is not going to be removed by reducing a bishop. I think there's actually an argument for saying that if you're going to make significant changes at a more local level, you may need to ensure you've got quite a lot of people at that kind of senior level who are able to oversee that process and to give it the drive and the energy that it needs.
Bervinder Singh, who hasn't yet been asked anything, I apologize, I'm not very good at this, handling things around.
It's okay.
What did you find when you were looking at the finances of Sikh Gurdwaras?
Yeah, so my name is Bervinder Singh. First time I've been on
with you guys. Why you were looking at it and in what?
Yeah, so part of the Sikh Council, 70% of our members are Gurdwara up and down the UK, with about 30% to Sikh organisations who are linked with Gurdwara as well. So the financial structure of a Gurdwara also sometimes affects the charities who work on like mental health, youth services and stuff like that as well. So we just ran a very simple survey with some of our members, which was just focused around how this last year has really affected them regarding donations, income and services that they've been providing to the community. It was quite surprising, really, some of the findings. We knew they were affected, but we didn't know on what scale. A lot of the Gurdwaras and what kind of divide between the larger Gurdwara and the smaller Gurdwara around the country there was. So one of the first questions on our survey was how income was affected between last pre-COVID, like 2019 compared to this year, 2020. And majority of the Gurdwara, like other places of worship, they were down income between 15 and 75% this past year. And this was mainly because of a lot of our main events that take place throughout the year, where are concentrating a lot more congregation attending the Gurdwara, like Vaisakhi fell in the first lockdown, and then the second lockdown we had Diwali and the birth of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. Also, when the lockdowns did open, we were in a lot of Gurdwaras in very strict tiers as well, which affected New Year's, where we have a lot more congregation coming to the Gurdwara and down in donations. And I think Harmeet mentioned it from South of Gurdwara as well earlier about weddings, a big income within. You've seen how Asians spend, how much money they spend on weddings these days. So with weddings being cancelled or rescheduled to the following year, that was a massive difference. Well, with the few weddings that did take place, there were only limits on how much congregation could attend or guests could attend those weddings. So which again, was a massive down in donations within the Gurdwara. Also, when we asked most of the Gurdwara, do you feel that 2021, this year, you'll see a bigger difference with will you see, your income coming back to pre-COVID? 85% said hopefully they would see a difference because of all the cancellations of programs, weddings last year, they've been moved to this year. So a lot of larger Gurdwara or Gurdwara that do a lot of weddings are already fully booked for this year. And, so they see that there's the healthy financial forecast for this year. But the other 15 or 20% were still struggling, saying, they're feeling the after effects of COVID with congregation as well, with in some areas unemployment within those areas is they can see it, and a lot more people are more dependent on the Langar services, and when the restrictions with communal worship is happening in some of the Gurdwara, the donations are still down because of the ongoing problems with unemployment and stuff like that. So there's less donations coming into the Gurdwara. A lot of Gurdwara, we did see a lot of organisations like people have mentioned on this call moving to online donations. Seeing a lot of crowdfunding pages set up, just giving pages. I'm based here in Birmingham, so one of the largest Gurdwara in Birmingham, Guru Nanak Gurdwara in Smethwick. It's probably one of the first Gurdwaras here. It was in the West Midlands and one of the largest. They set up a page the other day to raise £50,000 for building work. That's started before COVID, but because of donation, they've struggled to fulfill the the contracts with the companies, so they've started the page up as well.
Okay, sorry, completely ignorant question. Would this kind of work be normally funded by special appeals at the end of services or something? People get up,
so
we're going to
so
that sort of direct. Okay.
I would say 99% of all Godbury in the UK are funded through direct congregation donations. There might be a small percentage that run social enterprises or have property they rent out, which the income comes back into services within the Godbury. But I would say 99% would be, as you just said, asking for donations after the service. But we also have donation boxes. So when anybody comes into the Godbury, as in the Sikh community, part of our code of conduct, we give 10% of our earnings to a Godara. That's the sole reason why these Godara, run through congregation donations. And now in the lockdown myself, I attend my Godara in the mornings at 4 a.m. in the morning, and we have congregation coming from 4 a.m. in the morning all the way up to the evening, about 8, 9 o'clock. And when the lockdown happened, congregation was still coming to the steps of the Godara, even around the country. They'll come to the gates and just pay respects from there. And Godaras were finding donations in their letterboxes. I turned up in the Godara in the morning one day and found £20 underneath the door. So there were still small amounts of donations coming in from the older generation, which I was going to mention that with the online donations, a lot of the congregation within the Sikh community, I would say the most generous are the older generation, who are maybe first generation, second generation in this country. And some of them are still, IT illiterate. They might not have online means to make these donations, and they still work on bringing cash or cash donations to the Godara. So a lot of those donations, even though online funding pages have been set up, a lot of I would say probably 60-70% of the congregation still haven't been able to make those contributions because of.
It does seem, especially your point about people getting up at 4 a.m, a general point, something that perhaps hadn't been appreciated before the pandemic started, is how much people do in fact value their churches, their temples, their gurdwaras, their religious belongings. And again, how important do you think this factor has been in keeping, this is a general question for the panel, in keeping the congregations going? Did the secular world underestimate the importance of religion to those, to believers, or to participators, as it were?
I think so. I'm just talking from the Sikh community. I saw a massive urge from congregation just to be at the Godara. We would see people going for local walks, but making sure that the Godara falls in their daily walk so they can walk past. And once the doors were open back in, I think it was June when the first lockdown opened, we saw a massive flurry of people coming in to do prayers. Donations were up as well that month as well. And I think the country did underestimate what part religion or spirituality plays within the UK, and the need for people, the places of worship don't just physically feed people, they spiritually feed people as well. And there's a massive need. And I think how many people after the lockdown, personally, I know volunteering at the Godara in Birmingham, Hermit will probably tell you that once the doors were open, the thanks that people had, just thanking the people that now the doors were open and the services can carry on, and thanking the committees within these places of worship that some kind of connection to these places of worship, like online services carried on, so they had that certain connection. I just wanted to mention that, a lot of these Godare are worried. Just going back to our findings, some Godare did use a furlough system, but not many, because a lot of our smaller Godare in the UK may only have 1 or 2 employees. So if they reduce their employees, they wouldn't have had any services taking place at all at the Godare. And within the Godara, the whole service is based around Guru Granth Sahib Ji, who is our holy scriptures. And we Guru Granth Sahib Ji is seen by the Sikh community as a living person. So even though Gurdwaras might have been closed to congregation attending, but the services never stopped from morning to evening. So, you know, even in lockdown, myself as a volunteer would turn up at 4 a.m. and making sure that the prayers were done at 4 a.m. and then there would be evening volunteers coming in, helping the priests within the Gurdwara as well, because some of these buildings are quite big and services that take place take, you know,
Okay.
a lot of volunteers taking place.
Thank you. Ruth, you had a question.
Yes, I was just going to pick up on an earlier conversation about yesterday's decision to keep places of worship open. And I hear what you've been saying, Bhavindra, about the importance of a Gurdwara in your faith tradition. But there was a lot of skepticism on social media last night about whether that was in fact the right decision, that people are now so nervous about the virus and it is so rampant and out of control, that would it have been more sensible for places of worship to have been shut? And I just wonder if any of the faith leaders on here have seen signs of a rebellion of clergy and others going it alone and saying, no, we're not opening. Salisbury Cathedral, for example, is not holding public worship at the moment. I don't know if David Walker's seen signs of rebellion or any of the other faith leaders on the call.
I think Church of England clergy are naturally rebellious. It's one of the most important characteristics, isn't it, Ruth?
It's not the churches, they rebel, you open them, they rebel.
Yeah, we had rebellion certainly in the spring when the government required churches to close, and you know, some priests absolutely refused to do that. I think what I'm finding is that there's a mixed attitude among clergy about whether they want churches to be open or shut. Church of England has a clear procedure. If every church in a benefice is to be closed, then if it's a short-term closure, you know, for a few weeks or so, then the minister, that's usually the vicar, and the parochial church council together, if they agree that it should be closed, then they can close to public worship and they can hold their services online. If they want to do something much more long-term, then they have to get my permission and give me reasons as to why they want to close much longer term. I would have thought where we are at the moment in terms of the vaccine coming in, but the number of cases rising. Greater Manchester figure still around 250 per 100,000 population, which is probably about half the England rate. So we were you know, outliers at the wrong end back in October. We're probably among the lower areas at the moment. So I think clergy and PCCs will make their mind up what they want to do, and they'll get my backing when they've made their mind up. But some are clearly making plans to stay open. Some are considering passing motions to close temporarily.
And just to say, this is the start of our 4-week series of Zoom sessions on how COVID-19 is affecting religious institutions and religion in general. Next week, Tim White is in the chair. Tim, would you like to give us a flavour of what's in store?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion next week. We've got a great list of speakers, including David Voas, who's one of the leading sociologists of religion in the country in terms of counting numbers. We've got Peter Linus from the Evangelical Alliance to look at the Christian side. We've got Tilak Parekh, who's an expert on Hinduism, and then the well-known Imam and commentator Kari Asim. So we're going to be looking at how this age of COVID, this year of COVID, has affected attendance and membership. Are people coming to church, to synagogue, to mosques, whether online or in person, less? Or is actually the pandemic prompted a surge in the number of people attending and taking part in religion in this country? I don't know the answer yet. I'm excited to find out what our guests think. I think there's going to be a lot of speculation, a lot of interesting questions, a lot of answers, maybe not as many as we like, but let's find out. So please do join us again. This will be next Tuesday at 2 p.m.
Thanks, Tim. So it's great to see everyone again, really great. And look forward to seeing you all soon, certainly next Tuesday. All the best. Stay safe, everyone.